Hello everyone. If you are preparing for your PMP exam, then I know that you might be finding the schedule knowledge area a bit difficult to learn and master. Especially inside scheduling, we have some concepts like critical path, total float, free float, and critical path method, and so on. Now, to learn and master these concepts, you need some support and help. And that's why I came up with this video. So in this video, we're going to learn everything you need to know about total float and free float, how to calculate them, the key differences between total float and free float, what is meant by critical path method, and what is meant by forward pass and reverse pass, and so on. This video is going to be a little longer because learning is not an activity, it's a process. So we have to incrementally develop the knowledge. We need to start with the rudimentary things, and then we have to learn about advanced things related to the topic we chose to learn. Watch this video till the end. This is not to promote my video, because after watching this video, you don't have to read any blogs or books to master total float and free float. So let's get started. First, we'll start with what and all we're going to cover in this video and in which order. We'll first start with learning the fundamentals. We will learn about what is meant by a predecessor and a successor. Also, we'll learn about other important concepts like early start, early finish, late start, and late finish. So these are the prerequisites we need to know to calculate total float and free float in your project schedule. So we'll cover that first. Then we will learn about free float. Before learning total float, we must learn free float, because free float is the elementary thing. We understand how much amount of total float we have in the project schedule based on how much amount of free float we have in the project schedule. So first we will learn about free float, and then we will start with total float calculation. We will first find out how to calculate the total float value for paths. Then we'll work on finding how much amount of total float we have in each activity. So this is about critical path method, otherwise called as CPM. To learn CPM method or critical path method, we need to learn something called forward pass and reverse pass technique. So this is another tricky concept inside scheduling. So we will cover this in detail with an example. And finally, we will compare the differences between total float and free float. Okay, so that's about the agenda of this discussion. We'll start with understanding the basics. Okay, we'll start with learning what is meant by a predecessor and a successor. If you're already aware of this, you can skip and move forward to the next topic in this video. According to the PMP guide, a predecessor is an activity that logically comes before a dependent activity in a schedule. And a successor is a dependent activity that logically another activity in a schedule. Well, here I have two examples. The first one is from software development project. A predecessor is an activity which must be completed first to begin the successor. For example, if you take software development, first we need to develop the software, then we have to perform the test. Before developing the software, we cannot begin the testing work, isn't it? So development of the software comes first. We call this as the predecessor activity. After we finish the predecessor, logically we need to begin the successor, that is testing the software. We have another example from construction project. If you want to do the foundation, first we need to complete the excavation work. Excavate the ground is an activity that need to be performed first to begin the successor, that is build the foundation. So here excavate is the predecessor and build the foundation is the successor. I hope you are clear with the predecessor and successor. Now we're going to learn about the other things: early start, early finish, late start, and late finish. Okay, here I have a simple schedule for you. So if you take a schedule is made of a lot of activities done in a particular sequence. And in this schedule, pay attention to task A. So task A starts on day 1. Okay, so this axis is about days. Assume we work 7 days in a week in this project, and activity A is of 15 days duration, and we are starting this activity on day 1. And because this task is of 15 days duration, it will end on 15th day. All right, and we have another task here, activity B or task B. We're going to start this activity on day 1, but this activity is not that big, so this activity will complete on day 5 because this activity is only of 5 days duration. So this is about early start. How quickly, how early as possible you can start an activity. So that's about early start. You cannot start these two activities earlier than day 1. Okay, so that's why we call this as early start. Now let's talk about early finish. If you start a task based on its early start date, then the day on which it's going to end will be called as early finish. So in this case, because this task is of 15 days duration, if you start this task on day 1, if you add up this 15 days to day 1, you will get the early finish date. So to calculate the early finish date, we need to take the early start date plus you need to add up the duration of the task. So early start date here is day 1 plus this task is of 15 days duration. So this will fetch us 16 days, isn't it? But we need to subtract -1 from it every time. Whenever you calculate the early finish, whatever value you get, the total value you get, you need to subtract 1 day from it. The reason is you're going to work on day 1 as well. Okay, so within this 15 days of duration, we also have day 1 included. And that's why whenever you calculated the early finish date or late finish date, we need to subtract 1 day from it. So therefore this task will end on 15th day. So that's about the early finish date of this task. So early finish date is calculated based on adding the task duration to the early start date and subtracting 1 day from it. We do the same here and we found that it's 5th day. Okay, 5th day would be the early finish for this task. Early start is 1st day plus 5 days, you get 6 days -1, you get 5 days. So early finish is 5th day of this project calendar. I hope you're clear with early start and early finish. Now let's talk about late start and late finish. Late start and late finish are about how much delay you can induce in starting a task, that is delaying the start date of an activity, or extending the task, taking more time duration to complete the task. Okay, maybe you deploy less people. You cannot do anything with task A, because if you delay the start date of task A, it's going to affect the start date of task C and also the project schedule, isn't it? Or some other project schedule constraints. So you cannot delay the start date of this task. However, for task B you can do that, because you see here you have some amount of schedule flexibility in this region. So if you delay the start date of task B for 10 days, then the task B will move to 11th day, right? And day 11, and from here it's going to take 5 days, because the duration of this task is of 5 days. So if you add up 11 plus 5, you get 16, and 16 minus 1, because on 11th day we're going to do the work. So 5 days of effort or duration is inclusive of 11th day, and that's why we subtract 1 day from the total value. So 11 plus 5, you get 16. 16 minus 1, you get 15 days, isn't it? So day 15. So these 2 days are the late start and late finish. So one condition here is late start and late finish are calculated based on we should not affect the start date of the immediate successor activity or not affect the project end date or any other schedule constraint. So you have this many days of schedule flexibility here, and if you delay the start date of task B for 10 days, in this case, you're not going to affect the project schedule. So this amount of schedule flexibility you have with task B. You can either delay the start date of task B or you can extend task B. For example, you have allocated 2 people to perform task B. You have reduced this to 1 headcount now, and therefore task B is going to take 10 days of time. So if at all you're going to take more time to complete task B, or you're going to delay the start date of task B, if the delay or the extension is not greater than this amount of schedule flexibility you have here, that is 10 days, it's not going to impact the start date of the next immediate activity or the project end date. So that's about early start and early finish and late start and late finish. So for task A, the early start and late start are the same, day 1, because there's no play area for task A. I hope you agree, because here we have to start the project on day 1 and you cannot do anything beyond this point, because we must start task C on 16th day. If you delay the task A, start date of task A for 1 day, then it's going to affect the start date of task C. I hope you understood why for task A the late start and early start are equal, and so the late finish and early finish are equal. But for task B, they are different. Okay, so that's about early start, early finish, late start and late finish. For every activity in the schedule, you can calculate the early start date, late start date, early finish date and late finish date. We'll do this as part of CPM technique. We will cover this technique towards the end of this discussion. Okay, now you know about the fundamentals, ES, LS, EF, LF and predecessor and successor. Now let's dive in and understand how to calculate free float and what is free float is all about. Okay, according to the practice standard for scheduling published by PMI, it's a very useful material from PMI. If you have membership, PMI membership, you can download this book for free from PMI website. So please go for it. According to this standard, free float is defined as the amount of time and activities early finish date can be delayed without affecting any successor's activities early start date. So you already know what is meant by a predecessor, a successor, also early start, early finish, late start and late finish. Now here I have a small schedule. Now let's use this schedule to calculate free float and identify where and all we have free float. So to identify and calculate free float, we have to follow these 2 steps. First step is to identify places in your schedule where you can find free float, and to do this you need to look for a bunch of predecessors activities done concurrently and having a common successor. So let's go and find out where and all you have situations that fulfill this condition. Okay, if you look at task C, we have 2 task predecessors. This is predecessor 1 and this is predecessor 2, and this is the common successor for task A and task B, isn't it? Now if you see these two activities, predecessors, are done concurrently and they have a common successor. So these three activities perfectly fulfill this condition. A bunch of predecessors, here we have a bunch of predecessors done concurrently, yes, and they have a common successor. Here task C is the common successor for task A and task B. So that's about step 1. So here we have a situation that favors free float. Also you see there's another situation here. So here we have a predecessor. This is predecessor 1 and this is predecessor 2. Task F and task D. They run concurrently and they have a common successor, task G. Okay, now let's find out how much amount of free float we have here and here. Now to calculate free float, you need to use any one of these three formulas. I personally like this one because this is more relevant and self-explanatory, easy to remember. We will talk about the remaining two formulas as part of CPM, critical path method, inside this discussion. Okay, now to calculate free float, we always need to think delaying the predecessor will have an impact on the start date of the successor. So that's about the free float. You see here, we are only concerned about the start date of the successor activity. Are we going to induce any delay to the successor activity? So free float is always about the successor activity. Are we going to affect the successor activity by inducing a delay in the predecessor activities? Whereas total float is about, are we going to affect the project end date, finish date? That's about total float. Total float is always about, are we going to, if I'm delaying this activity, start date of this activity, or extending the duration of this activity, will that impact my project end date? Then we are talking about total float. Free float is always about the successor activity. If I induce a delay in completing an activity, a predecessor activity, will that affect the start date of the successor activity? Then we are talking about free float. Now in this case, you have no free float with task A because you see here, task A begins on day 1 and ends on day 15, and on day 16 we're going to start task C. So if you delay this task A, by 1 day, either you're delaying the start date of this activity or you're going to take more time. You have started this activity on day 1, but instead of completing this task in 15 days, let's say you're going to take 16 days. Apparently it will affect the start date of the task C. So you have no float, free float here with task A. However, if you take task B, you can delay the start date of task B by 10 days. Okay, still it won't impact the start date of task C because you have some amount of schedule flexibility here. Now let's visualize this using MS project. Okay, I have this same schedule here in the MPP. Now I'm going to change the start date of task B. Before that, let me do it with task A. I've already told you task A has 0 free float. So let's say we are starting task A 1 day later. So early start date of task A is day 1. I'm going to move it to the next day. I'm inducing 1 day of delay here. Now look at the start date of task C. You have to look at this point. So I'm going to delay this by 1 day. Start date of task A. You see here it has affected the start date of task C by 1 day. But if you take task B, so we are starting this on April 1st. Now I'm going to delay the start date of task B by 3-4 days. You see here the start date of task B has been changed, but still task C start date is intact. So let's delay this further. I'm going to change it to 9. Still it has no impact on the start date of task C. I could see that still there's no impact, but we have reached the threshold. You see, we consumed all the schedule flexibility we had with task B. Now, if I'm going to delay this one more day further, let's change this to 11 to 12. You see, it has affected the schedule. It has induced a delay. So task C start date has been shifted one day later. So this is not a good situation. So we understood that task B has some amount of schedule flexibility, but task A doesn't have anything with it. And that amount of schedule flexibility is called as the free float. Now if you read the definition, it will make sense. The amount of time and activities, early finish date, you see, this is the early finish date, can be delayed without affecting any successor activities early start date. Alright, so you are delaying this finish date. If you take around about 10 days in finishing this activity, delaying the finish date of this activity, it has no impact on the start date of task C. So that's about free float. Okay, we have the same here as well. You can delay the finish date of task F this much, and still there won't be any impact on the start date of the successor activity, that is task G. But if you exceed this amount of free float, it's going to have an impact on task G. Now we're going to calculate this duration in both the cases using this first formula. Okay, so to calculate free float, we need to take the early start date of the successor and subtract early finish date of the predecessor. So we know in this case this is the successor and this is the predecessor. Now we need to take the early start of the successor, so that would be this day. So in this case it is day 16, and next item we need is early finish date of the predecessor. So this is the early finish date of the predecessor, and that would be day 5. Now we're going to take 16, that is the early start date of the successor, and this one is early finish date of the predecessor. So then this value 16 minus this value 5, and we have to subtract this whole value with 1 day, because fifth day is part of day 1's schedule activity of task B. So we need to include it inside the calculation, and later we need to subtract it from the total value. So we get 11 minus 1, we get 10. So 10 days is the amount of free float we have here. Okay, so task B has a free float of 10 days. So task F is going to finish on 30th day. This is the early finish of the predecessor, and this is the early start of the successor. Now this value is about 41. So 41 minus 30 minus 1, we get 10 days. So that's about the amount of float we have with task F. So task F has 10 days of free float. Okay, I hope you understood how to calculate free float. Always remember, free float is all about finding out how much delay you can have in delaying the start date of the predecessor or extending the duration of the predecessor without affecting its successor's start date. Okay. Now let's talk about total float. To learn about total float, we need to first understand that total float is all about how much delay you can have in completing a task or activity without affecting the end date, finish date of the project. It's not just about the start date of the successor, that's about the free float. Total float is about, are we going to delay the finish date of the project, the entire project. Okay. Now first let's understand how much amount of total float we have in each path, and then we will identify how much amount of float we have in each activity. So by definition, total float is the amount of time an activity's early start date or early finish date may be delayed without impacting the project end point, that is project finish date. The total float value is shared among all of the activities in a specific path. If you recall, free float is only available for that particular predecessor activity. It cannot be shared by other activities. You cannot delay another activity. You can only use that free float for the activity which has it, hold it, own it. For example, in the previous case, task B had 10 days of free float, so you can only delay task B and use that free float. You cannot use it for task C or task E. But total float is not like that. All the activities in a particular path can use the total float available with a particular activity in that path. That's something nice about total float. Now we will first start with identifying the paths in a schedule, and then we will find out the critical path, and we will find out how much amount of total float we have in the non-critical paths. Now let's trace how many paths are there in this schedule. So we will have the first path here, task A, C, D, then G. This is path 1. Then we have the second path. So this is task A, C. Then we have E, F, and G. Then we have the third path here, B, C, D, and then G. And fourth path is here, B, C, E, F, and G. Okay, so there are 4 paths. So let's name them 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we'll make this table to find out how much amount of total float we have in each path. So here we have the path numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and then here we have the activities in the paths or tasks in the paths. So path 1 is made of activity A, C, D, and G, and so we have information for all other paths. And the next thing we need to do is we need to find the length of each path in terms of days, calendar days. So for that we need to add up the duration of each task in the corresponding paths. If you take path 1, it's made of activity A, C, D, and E, G. So you have to add up the duration of these tasks. So 15 plus 10 plus 15 plus 10. So we got 50 days. Likewise, we're going to do for the remaining paths, and we found the duration of each path. Okay. Now it's time to find out the project duration. To do that, first we need to identify the critical path. The longest path in the schedule will be the critical path, and it will not have any float value in it. And according to this definition, it's very evident that path 1 is the longest path. It's a minimum amount of time we need to complete the project. So Path 1 is a critical path and it determines the project duration. So project duration will be 50 days. Whether we complete this sequence, and this sequence faster, let's take this one. We can complete all the activities in this path in 30 days, but still we need to finish all the activities in path 1, especially activity G. Activity G is in path 1, it's also in all other paths. So before completing these 3 activities, you cannot perform activity G. So it is a bottleneck. And therefore, the project duration is common for all the paths, right? Even if you complete these 4 activities so fast, before completing A, C, and D, you cannot begin activity G. So therefore, the longest path determines the project duration. And therefore, we take this path duration as a project duration, 50 days. Now it's time to calculate total float available in each path. So for that, we need to take the project duration and subtract the path duration from it. So 50 minus 50, you get 0 here. 50 minus 40, you get 10 days of float in path 2. And the same here, 50 minus 40, you get 10 days. 50 minus 30, you get 20 days. Okay. So it's clear that in the critical path, you get 0 amount of float, total float. Whereas in all other non-critical paths, so these are the non-critical paths and they are smaller than the critical path. And so they have some amount of float in them, total float in them. And that's how we find how much amount of total float we have in each path. Now, the question is, okay, I understood. Path 4 has 20 days of total float. This is the amount of schedule flexibility. You can have 20 days of delay inside path 4. Still, you won't affect the project end date. Clear? But can I delay this task? This task is in path 4. Can I delay this task for 20 days? No. If you delay this task B for 20 days, it's going to affect the project end date. You can only delay this task for 10 days. You agree? The same with this task and this task. So you cannot just use the entire amount of float you have, total float you have in a particular path to a particular activity. It's not possible. So that's why we're going to find out, okay, we have in total 20 days of total float in path 4, but where are they? How much amount of schedule flexibility I have with each task? You look at the definition. Total float is all about the amount of time and activities early start date or early finish date will be delayed without impacting the project end date. So we have to go to each and every activity in all the paths to find out how much amount of total float we have with them. So for this, we're going to learn about something called critical path method, and we're going to do something called forward pass and reverse path. Now, if you are staying with me this long, please watch this video till the end, because after we finish this video, you will know everything about total float and free float, and you will become a master in managing your schedule. And if you start feeling overwhelmed, take a break now and resume the discussion after some time. Okay. Now let's talk about how to find out how much amount of total float we have in each activity. So for this, we're going to use something called forward pass and backward pass. So this is part of critical path method. I have taken the schedule and created a schematic like this. Now for each task we have here, I have created a schematic, a layout with some basic information. So primarily we want to capture the duration of each task, the early start date, the early finish date, the late start date, the late finish date of each activity. Because to calculate the total float for each activity, we need to know either early start and late start, for each activity, or early finish and late finish for each activity. And that's why we have these pieces of information captured in this layout. Okay. And now let's start with calculating early start and early finish for each activity we have in the schedule. So first we need to fill up the activity duration. Okay, I've already provided the name of each activity in the block. Also I captured the duration of each activity. For example, if we take activity 8, so 15 days duration, I've captured that here. And we also captured the dependency of the activities. For example, activity A and B need to be completed to begin activity C. So we have captured that here. And we are starting both activity A and B on the same date. And once you are done with activity C, we're going to begin activity D and E. And you have to finish activity E to begin activity F. You see here, we captured that dependency. And then to start activity G, we have to complete D and F. So we have captured the relationship as well. Now it's time to calculate the early start and early finish of all the activities using forward pass technique. So first, we know that we're going to start the project on day 1. So first task in the project schedule will get day 1 as the early start. So task A and task B will be started on day 1, and so I'm going to put the early start for these two activities as 1 and 1. Okay. Now to find the early finish, we know that we need to add up the duration of the task with the early start. So this is the early start day 1, and this is the duration 15 days. If you add 15 days with this one, you get 16 days, and we have to subtract 1 from it, because on day 1 also we're going to do the work, perform the work. So day 1 is part of the task duration, so we have to add the task duration with the early start of the task and subtract 1 from it. So for forward pass, please follow these two rules. To calculate the early finish, that is this one, we need to first take the early start of the task and add up the task duration and subtract 1 from it. So if you do that, we get 15 here, right? So 1 plus 15, we get 16. 16 minus 1, 15. Let's do this for this task. So 1 plus 5, 6. 6 minus 1, 5. Okay. Now we finished the early finish date for task B and task A. Okay. Let's move forward. We will cover late start and late finish during the backward pass or reverse pass. Now let's determine the start date, early start for task C. So for this, we need to use this rule, rule number 2. During path convergence or divergence, take the highest early finish value of the predecessors. You see here, these are the two predecessors for this task. And here we have path convergence. Okay, so I'm gonna take the highest EF value. In this case, this is the highest EF value, because you cannot start this task C, no sooner than completing task A. So this acts as a schedule constraint. So we have to take task A's early finish date here and put it as the early start of task C. But you cannot directly use this number, because on 15th day we will complete this task A. So the next day we will begin. So rule number 2 is you have to take the highest value of the early finish date of the predecessors and add 1 to it. And therefore here we're going to take 15 and I'm going to add 1 to it, so it's 16. Now we got the early start date of task C. You cannot start task C no sooner than day 16. And let's find out the early finish date of task C. So I'm going to add 10 days to early start date of task C and subtract 1 from it. I'm going to use rule number 1. So it's 26 minus 1, 25. Okay, so on 25th day, task C will be done. Now I'm gonna take this as the early start for the other two activities, and we need to add 1 to it because on 25th day, task C will be completed. So the next day only we can start task D and task E. So 25 plus 1, 26 here and here. Now to find the early finish date for task D, I'm going to add these two numbers and subtract 1 from it. So I got 40 here, and when I do that here, 26 plus 2 minus 1, I got 27. Yeah, so we will finish this task. So I'm going to take this plus 1 as the start date of task F, because on 27th, task E will be completed, and I will start task F on the next day, that is on 28th. So EF of the predecessor plus 1 will give us ES of the successor task. Now after we add up these two numbers and subtract 1 from it, I got 30 here. Now it's time to determine the early start of task G. Task G cannot be started no sooner than this particular day, because this is the longest task, predecessor task G has. As soon as you complete task F, you need to wait until we complete task D. So therefore we have to take the highest early finish date of the predecessors, subtract 1 from it to get the start date of the successor, early start date of the successor. On 40th day, task D will be completed. The next day we will begin task G. Okay, now if you add up these two numbers and subtract 1 from it, we found it's going to take 50 days. Alright, so on 50th day we will finish task G as well. Now we are done with the forward pass. Now let's apply backward pass or reverse pass to find out the late finish and late start of all the activities. Only then we can calculate the total float we have for each task. So to begin with, we will first go from the reverse, okay, backward. So in forward pass we started from here, right? In reverse pass or backward pass, we need to start from the late finish of the last task in the schedule. So I'm going to use the same date here as 50. Now you have to use these two rules for finding out the late finish and late start of all the tasks using backward pass. Okay, now we're going to calculate LS for this task, late start for this task. For that we need to use this formula. You have to take the late finish date, we have it here, and we have to subtract the task duration. In forward pass we take this number and we add the task duration to get this one. In this case we already have this one, and instead of adding the duration, we want to subtract the task duration from the late finish of the task, and we're gonna add 1 to it. Okay, because in forward pass we always subtract 1 from it. In reverse pass we always need to add 1 to it, the total value, because 50th day is included inside the late start calculation. So I'm going to subtract 10 from 50 and add 1 to the total value. So when I do that, I got 41 here, and so this is the LS value. Now this will go as the late finish for task D and task F, but before we take that and use it, we need to subtract 1 from it. Remember, in forward pass, when you move this to the next activity, we added 1 to it, but when in the backward pass we need to subtract 1 from it. So 40 minus 1, we get 40 here and here, and I'm gonna subtract the task duration from 40 here and add 1 to it. So I got 38 here, and if I do the same here, I get 26 here. So we are subtracting 15 from 40 and adding 1 to it. So we got 26. And here we have 38. So 38 minus 1, we get 37. So we put it here and we add 2 to it and subtract 1 from it. And we got 36. Again, we're gonna find out the late finish of task C. So for this, you have two options here. Now in the backward pass, we always need to take the smallest number. Follow rule number 2. Whenever you have a path of convergence or divergence, you have to take the smallest late start value of the successor minus 1 as the late finish of the predecessor. Okay, this is opposite of forward pass. In forward pass, we go with the highest early finish value. In reverse pass, we need to take the smallest late start value. Okay, so in this case 26 is the smallest, and I'm going to subtract 1 from it, so I get 25, and I'm going to subtract 10 from 25 and add 1 to it, so I got 16 here. Now 16 is the LS for these two, so 16 minus 1, we get 15 here, and the same goes here. I'm going to subtract 15 from 15 and add 1 to it, so I get 1 here, and in this case I get 11. Now we are done with the early start, early finish, late start and late finish identification process or calculation process. I know this is a little overwhelming, so please watch this portion of this video one more time, because both to pass the PMP exam, also to manage project schedule, you need to be very strong with the critical path method. Even if you attend interviews, you will get questions. Because I'm teaching this repeatedly, I'm very comfortable with this technique. But for you, if you're new to this technique, please watch this portion of the video one more time, and you will be fine with this technique. Okay? And if you like my way of teaching and this video, please give me a thumbs up. And you can also subscribe to my channel, because I regularly come up with a lot of useful project management learning materials and publish them on my channel GAN Scholar. So you can learn a lot of useful project management techniques and tools by subscribing to my channel. Now it's time to calculate the total float value. So to calculate total float, either you use late start of a task minus early start of the task, or late finish of the task minus early finish of the task. Now let's start from task A. So LS minus AS will fetch us 0. The same here. Late finish minus early finish, 15 minus 15, you get 0. In this case, LS minus ES or LF minus EF will get 10, isn't it? So now I'm gonna use only this formula, LS minus ES. If you want to use LF minus EF, it will fetch you the same result, so it's up to us to decide. So I'm gonna use LS minus ES. So in this case, 16 minus 16, I get 0. Here 26 minus 26, I get 0. Here 36 minus 26, I get 10. Here 38 minus 28, I get again 10. And here 41 minus 41, we get 0. Boom. Now we have identified how much amount of float, total float, we have in each activity. So for example, if we take path 4, we found that in total we have 20 days of total float. However, you cannot use this 20 days of schedule flexibility on a particular task, all 20 days. It's not possible. It's going to definitely impact the project end date. For example, here you can delay task B for 10 days because we found that task B has, you see, 10 days of float, total float, not more than that. So if you try to use 20 days of free float we have in that path, it's going to affect the project end date. So it's very evident that if you take a path 4, path 4, you can have a schedule flexibility of 10 days with task B and 10 days with task E and another 10 days with task F. Now you have to be very careful here. You can ask me, Ahmed, in this table we have only 20 days of total float in path 4. Then how come here we get 30 days? Here we have 10. Here we have another 10. Here we have another 10. Totally there is 30 days of total float. No, it's incorrect. I've already told you total float is shared by the task in that path. Okay. Now, if you take this 10 days of float, total float, it is only available for task B because it has no other buddies beside him or her. But if you take these two tasks, they share this 10 days of float. So either you can have 10 days of delay here and 0 days of delay with task F, or you can have 5 days of delay in completing task E, another 5 days here, or 0 days of delay here, 10 days of delay here, or 3 days of delay here, 7 days of delay here. In all the cases, the total net value should not exceed 10 days. Okay, otherwise you're going to affect the project end date. So originally the float is coming from the free float we have in task F, and that is shared by task E and task F. All right. Now let me show you this. We know that in this schedule task B and task D has 10 days of free float. But if you look at task E is a special task. It doesn't have any free float, isn't it? Because it doesn't, if you see the requirements, if you want to calculate free float, there should be a bunch of predecessors that should have a common successor. In this case, task E has only one successor, and it doesn't have, task F has no other predecessor. So task E is not qualified for free float calculation. However, it is eligible. It has 10 days of total float. Total float is all about how much amount of delay you can have in completing a task without affecting the project end date. Let's delay this task. So I'm delaying this task. Start date of task E. You see, still the project end date is intact. So we have reached the threshold. We consumed 10 days of total float E had. Of course, that is coming from the free float what task F had, isn't it? So originally task E doesn't have any schedule flexibility on its own, that is free float. It is actually leveraging the free float what task F has, and that is getting translated into total float for task E, because task E is not affecting the project end date even after having a delay of 10 days in starting it. Now let's change this to 7. Now you see it's going to affect the project end date. You see it has become 20 from 25 to 21.5. So now we are done with all the available total float E had. But the key learning from this discussion is total float is actually shared by activities in that same path. So here we have delayed the start date of activity E to some days, and I'm going to do that with this activity. Okay, you see here now I'm playing with both the activities start date, but until you don't exceed the net value of 10 days of total float in delaying task E and task F completion, it won't affect the project end date. And that's why we say total float is shared by activities in a particular path. But there's one condition. If you look at the definition of total float, this is a very important point. Total float value is shared among all of the activities in a specific path to either a point where paths merge. So this is a path merger point. If you do not have a path merger point, then the utilization of the available float of a particular task, free float of a particular task, is available for almost all tasks in that path. Let's say you have something like this. This is path 1, this is path 2, this is path 3. Assume this is a critical path, and so it has no float. But in this task, we found there's a float of 10 days. And in this path 3, here we found a total float of 20 days. So both are total float. Okay. Now, because here we don't have any path mergers, you see all paths are straight lines. So the total float of 10 days you have here is applicable for all other tasks in that path. They are shared by all other tasks in the path. So all these tasks can share this 10 days of total float, but provided the net delay should not be greater than 10 days. For example, here you can have 2 days of delay, and here you can have 5 days of delay, other 2 days of delay here, 1 day of delay here. So if you add up the total value, it should be 10. So it's not that you can have 10 days of delay in each case, and so you can have 40 days of delay. This is incorrect. Yeah, if you calculate total float using critical path method, let's say here we have 10 days of free float. That 10 days of free float will become 10 days of total float for each task in this path, and doesn't mean that you have 40 days of schedule flexibility. You have only 10 days of total float schedule flexibility, but you can afford to have in total 10 days of delay in all the activities in that particular path. So this amount of float is shared by all the activities in the particular path. So here we don't have any path mergers, and that's why you are able to use this particular task's free float as total float for all the tasks in this path. But in this case, you have path merger here? If so, it will act as a barrier, and here also there is a path merger. So this float, 10 days of total float, cannot cascade to other activities in that path. So it acts as a barrier. And here we have another barrier. So between these two barriers, this particular task has 10 days of free float, and that will become 10 days of total float for both task E and task F. But this number is shared. You can either have 10 days of delay with task E, and that won't affect the project end date. You can have 10 days of delay in task F alone, or you can have 5 days of delay in task E and task F. Until you don't exceed the net value of 10, delay of net value of 10 days, there won't be an impact on the project end date. So to summarize, in this schedule, for task A, we have 0 days of total float and 0 days of free float. With task B, we have 10 days of total float and 10 days of free float. This is the summary of both the critical path method. Here we calculated the total float value for each activity, and here we calculated the free float for each activity. So I have summarized both the findings in one page. And if you take task C, it has 0 free float and total float. If you take task D, again it has 0 free float and total float. Task G doesn't have any free float and total float. However, task E has total float of 10 days, but it doesn't have free float of 0 day. If you take task F, it has both 10 days of total float and 10 days of free float. But if you take these two numbers, we have to be very careful. This 10 days of delay is a shared number. Alright, so as I already told you, you can have 10 days of delay here, or 5 days here, 5 days here, or 3 days here, 7 days here. The net value should not exceed 10 days of delay. Okay, I hope you understood what is meant by total float and free float, and you find this discussion very useful. If you feel overwhelmed, don't worry. When I learned this concept for the first time, I too felt this topic is a little overwhelming. So you need to watch this video one more time to get a good understanding of this discussion, these concepts, that is free float and total float, CPM, and forward pass and reverse pass. I also provided you an exercise so that you can work on how to calculate total float using forward pass and reverse pass technique. There's a link in the description. You click this link, download this worksheet, and play with it. Do it by yourself. Once you do this exercise, you will get a clear understanding of this concept. Okay? Great. To conclude this discussion, here we have the key differences between total float and free float. By definition, total float is all about the amount of time an activity can be delayed or extended without affecting the project finish date or end date. So total float is all about, are we gonna do something bad to the finish date of the entire project? When it comes to free float, we are only talking about the immediate next activity, that is the successor activity. Free float is the amount of time an activity can be delayed without affecting the early start date of the successor activity. And point of view, we are only thinking about the project finish date. Whenever we calculate the total float for an activity, we always think how much delay we can afford to have in completing this activity without affecting the project finish date. Whereas in free float, we don't want to delay the early start date of the successor activity. We don't think about the final project end date. So to calculate total float, we use these two formulas. late start minus early start, and late finish minus early finish of that particular task. Okay. For free float calculation, you can use these two formulas, but I prefer this one better over the other two formulas. When it comes to free float calculation, we have to take the start date of the successor and subtract the early finish date of the predecessor, and we have to subtract 1 from the total value. Scope: total float value is shared among all the activities in a specific path to either a point where path merge or to the project endpoint. If there are no paths merge, then the available free float of a particular task will be shared by all the activities in that particular path and will be considered as their own total float. But remember, the net delay should not exceed the total float of individual activities in that particular path. When it comes to free float scope is local to the individual activity. So if you have a free float with a particular predecessor, it is only applicable for that specific activity because we are only thinking about the next immediate successor activity's start date. Okay, so these are the key differences between total float and free float. With that, we are done with this discussion. I hope you liked this discussion. If so, please give me a thumbs up, and also you can subscribe to my channel because I regularly come up with a lot of useful project management videos. So you can subscribe to my channel to learn project management at ease. Also, if you have any idea to take any project management training, including PMP, you can register in our bootcamp. We have excellent reviews and ratings for our training. Also, we offer this training for very affordable pricing. The best part is you can attend the first 2 days of the training, that is first 10 hours of the training for free to enjoy the training, to assess its quality. If you find the training useful and effective, then you can continue with us. The link for registering in our PMP bootcamp is in the description. So please go and register if you're interested. I will meet you again with another interesting and useful video. Thanks for watching this video. Bye-bye.